I'd like to welcome everybody to this next presentation in the Community of Practice webinars. The Risk Informed Performance Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C of ANS, has been putting on these events for the past 5 years. Presentations and recordings of the events are available to the public at the ANS website under the tab RP3C. There are now over 50 such recordings available. The purpose of these webinars is to offer practitioners of concepts and methods related to risk-informed and performance-based approaches, RIPB we call it, a chance to share their knowledge and experience. I would expect that such practice is used for implementing nuclear technology and evaluating its safety and effectiveness. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA of 2019, associated modernization with RIPB approaches. Congress reiterated and reinforced the idea of using RIPB in the ADVANCE Act of 2024. There's growing realization within the nuclear community that conventional, prescriptive, and deterministic approaches are not going to support increasing use of nuclear technology to play its rightful role for the benefit of society. Socializing alternative approaches could drive changes in industry and regulatory practices. ANS offers the COP files on its website to serve as a knowledge repository of the experience from a wide range of practitioners in the field. We hope that more people will use this knowledge base to speed up needed changes in the state of the art as well as the state of practice. These events are generally scheduled for the last Friday of a month. Today we will hear from Tim Sande, who will introduce himself and the subject of his presentation. Thank you, and take away, Tim.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Tim Sande. I'm a senior manager responsible for PRA and risk-informed engineering in the nuclear services group at Enercon. My first involvement with risk applications was about 15 years ago. I was actually one of the team members responsible for developing a risk-informed approach for GSI 191, the emergency core cooling system strainer performance evaluation. That was piloted by South Texas. And as part of that approach, we actually were able to show that it wouldn't be necessary to completely replace all of the insulation and containment, which would have cost on the order of $50 million and a couple hundred rem of dose. And it was really an incredible achievement. And several other plants followed a risk-informed approach, and even the plants that continued to address the issue deterministically were able to close it much more easily because the risk-informed approach showed that there was a significant amount of conservatism in the deterministic methods, and it was not a risk-significant issue anymore based on the changes that plants had made over the years. So that really got me excited about other areas that we could apply risk-informed methods to. And here, about 15 years later, now I'm the leader of Enercon's PRA group, and I just love my job. I love what I'm able to do. I've been involved in risk-informed security for about 5 years now as a member of the JCNRM security working group, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So in my presentation, I'm going to kind of cover what the security working group is and our objectives and our progress so far. I'm going to talk about a white paper for risk-informed security, for the framework for risk-informed security that was recently developed by the security working group. I'm going to make a case for quantifying attack likelihood, which is probably the most controversial aspect of risk-informed security, and leave you with some key points to consider. So ASME and ANS have a joint committee on nuclear risk management, which is responsible for developing PRA standards. Within JCNRM is the subcommittee on risk applications, which I'm also a member of. SCORA does not actually develop any standards, but rather is more of an advisory subcommittee responsible for supporting other organizations with risk applications, providing expert reviews and comments and things like that. About 7 years ago or so, there was some discussion about risk-informing security and a desire to form a working group to develop guidance for that. And so the security working group was formed at that point, and it is not developing standards. The mission is to develop guidance for how to risk-inform physical and cybersecurity. I joined it after it had already started. I became a member back in 2020. And over time, our progress was actually kind of slow. We were developing some documentation, but we had kind of bit off more than we could chew in terms of developing the overall guidance. Our mission for the guidance is basically find a way to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of nuclear facility, physical and cybersecurity programs by applying the risk methods that we know well from safety applications. And also, we want to integrate safety and security risk together so that we can make more uniform decisions using the insights that we gain. Basically, a way to be able to compare apples to apples, the risk from safety versus the risk from physical security versus the risk from cybersecurity, and be able to make the right decisions based on that information. So I would say roughly 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago, we started through the process of developing a white paper for the framework. One of the things that we had realized from our initial efforts is that we need to be able to focus better on the stuff that's really important. And we had lots of ideas of different pieces, but we wanted to be able to bring those together and show how they all fit together so that the pieces make more sense. So this white paper, which was released earlier this year, basically has two purposes. One is a communication tool with various stakeholders, including this group, to be able to explain what it is that we're trying to do and how we're going about it. And the other is an internal purpose for the working group to basically be able to identify what the pieces are and which pieces we should be working on as priorities. Our scope within the security working group is very broad. It encompasses all nuclear facilities, so that's power plants, fuel processing facilities, test reactors. Basically any type of nuclear facility falls within our charter. We also are looking at physical security, cybersecurity, and combined physical and cyber attacks. And we're considering a range of potential consequences. Public health and safety is obviously one of the most important ones, radiological release, but also there are potential financial consequences that we might be concerned about, whether that's property damage or loss of power generation or other things like that. And there may be other consequences as well, maybe just loss of life that's not necessarily directly related to radiological release. In addition, we have not yet developed the guidance for risk-informing security, and it's likely that the guidance that we end up developing will include some combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. So based on that, our framework has to be defined at a relatively high level to address that broad scope, to be able to address the qualitative and quantitative methods, the fact that power plants have PRA models, but fuel processing facilities do not typically. Physical and cybersecurity have some overlapping terminology, but they also have some unique terminology. And our framework needs to encompass all of that. So sometimes you may not see a specific term that you're used to seeing as a cybersecurity expert or a physical security expert or a PRA expert. But that was intentional to basically be able to have a broad enough framework that covers all those things. We also didn't want to make the framework so high level and broad that it really didn't have any meaning. We wanted to be able to clearly show how the pieces fit together and where each element fits as we're developing things. I'd also like to kind of cover the fundamental risk assessment principles that are the foundation for the framework. And I think for this audience, probably these things are very familiar to most of you, but just want to go over them briefly. So first of all, the risk triplet is important as the quantitative definition of risk. What can go wrong? How likely is it? And what are the consequences? And likelihood specifically has been a key point of contention because it has not typically been assessed as part of deterministic security assessments. As most of you know, there are two elements to likelihood. You have the likelihood of an initiating event, which for security would be basically the attack likelihood. And then you have the likelihood of a series of subsequent failures that could result in the undesired consequence. Both those things are really important, as we'll talk about in some later slides. There's already been a lot of work done on that second element of the probability of failures, definitely for safety in our PRA models, but also for security. And so the likelihood of the initiating event, the attack likelihood, is really kind of one of the key elements that is most challenging to address. Another fundamental principle is that a risk-informed approach should be realistic, and we should excuse me, we should avoid conservatism, or if we need to use some conservatism, we should use it with caution. The reason for that is that conservatism masks the real risk contributors. If we evaluate something realistically, we can identify what is impacting the risk significance most significantly, whereas if you use conservatism, you might see something that you say, well, this has the most risk impact, but it may just be the area where you added the most conservatism, and some other area where you added less conservatism may be the real risk driver. So it's important for us to understand that, but when we do that, we don't have perfect knowledge of what reality is, and so we have to directly assess the uncertainty as part of a risk-informed application. And then finally, it's important for us to focus on the ultimate consequence of concern. For example, if we're considering the health and safety of the public, we want to know the likelihood of radiological release as opposed to an intermediate consequence like the likelihood of an adversary accessing a restricted area. If an adversary gets to a place they're not supposed to be, that's probably a bad day for the security manager and his team, but it's not necessarily something that would result in radiological release. There may be several other things that the adversary would have to accomplish before the release happens, and taking those other things into account gives you a better perspective of what the overall risk is. One other thing I want to talk about before showing you the framework itself is what a framework is. So the dictionary defines it simply as a supporting structure around which something can be built. Basically, it defines the essential elements and shows how those elements fit together. If you picture the frame of a house, you can walk through it, you can see how the rooms connect together, where the living room is going to go, where the kitchen's going to go, and the bedrooms. You can picture the plumbing, where that's going to come in. It doesn't tell you everything. You don't know if the finishing materials are going to be really high-end expensive ones or inexpensive materials, but you can get a pretty good picture of what the final product will be. That's basically what we're trying to accomplish with the risk-informed security framework as well. I added this quote from the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences that I thought was really good. And specifically this last sentence I really like. Although most frameworks are likely to have shortcomings, flaws, or controversial features, the fact that they motivate engagement around common problems and stimulate scholarly engagement is a value of its own. So we're not claiming that the framework we've developed is perfect, and there may be changes and tweaks that we make to it as we continue down the path of developing guidance. But what this paragraph says has already proven itself in the work that we've done. We've had a lot of really good scholarly engagement within the security working group as we've debated whether elements should or should not be included in the framework and how they fit together. And it's also been very useful for discussion purposes with other stakeholders outside of the working group. So this is what we've got for the framework. It's relatively simple. We tried to identify what all the essential elements are. And I'll step through each one of these. I'm not going to start at the top left, though. I'm going to actually start with consequences. And the reason for that, so consequences is basically just the undesired outcome that you're assessing. With our safety PRA models, the consequences that we typically consider are core damage and large early release. And so that might be the consequence you care about for security, or might be some other consequence. Well, why is that important to think of first? Because the targets and threats that you have are dependent on the consequences that you care about. If you're looking at radiological release, there's a certain set of things that an adversary could do that could cause radiological release. On the other hand, if you're considering generation risk assessment, there's a certain set of things that the adversary could do to cause the power plant to go down, either for a limited period of time or maybe permanently. So those consequences are very important to identify up front. The threats basically just represents your classes of adversaries. Who is it that wants or might want to attack your plant or your facility? It could be a terrorist group, it could be a disgruntled employee, it could be a criminal. Identifying those classes of adversaries and their capabilities, their knowledge of the facility, tools and equipment they've got, all of that is important to be able to define the scenarios that you need to assess. So the targets represent the system structures and components, as well as the operator actions that need to be protected to prevent the consequence that you care about from occurring. So that could include a lot of the things that are modeled in an existing PRA for a power plant. But basically, you're identifying what it is that you would need to protect. Taking the threats and targets and combining those basically gives you a set of scenarios that you need to consider. And the scenarios box and three of the other boxes are highlighted blue. Basically, the reason for that is that for each scenario, you need to evaluate that scenario consistently from the initiator, the attack point, up to the answer, does it lead to the consequence you care about? So you're looking at security effectiveness, you're looking at facility response, and you're determining some likelihood of proceeding to the consequence. Once you finish that for one scenario, you move to the next scenario, and you basically repeat that process. The security posture is essentially everything that you're doing to protect the facility. So it includes the number of guards you have, how they're armed, the fences and doors and card readers, your detection equipment, your cameras and sensors and things like that. All of that goes into the security posture for the facility, which is a direct input for security effectiveness. Where security effectiveness is essentially an assessment of the likelihood that the adversary will either partially or fully accomplish their objectives. So if they're trying to take out a certain target set, how likely is it that they take out some elements of the target set or all of the elements of the target set, which is really based on the definition of the scenario as well as your security posture. The dividing line between security effectiveness and facility response is really the adversary neutralization. Once you've neutralized the adversary, you're able to say, okay, this is what they accomplished before they were neutralized. Now, what happens from there? If they took out say, 3 out of 4 elements in a target set, there's some likelihood that the 4th element may fail randomly. And so that's something that can be assessed with an existing PRA model for a power plant. And so that would be basically the facility response piece, looking at that likelihood of progressing to the consequence you care about following the adversary neutralization. On the flip side, maybe the adversary took out the entire target set, but based on some analysis, you say, well, it's going to be an extended period of time before I have radiological release, and there are some mitigative actions I can take that would prevent that release. And so that would also be considered as part of the facility response assessment. So the next element is attack likelihood, which is essentially equivalent to your initiating event frequency for a safety PRA model. Typically in a PRA model, you see the initiating event frequency up front that feeds into the scenario, that feeds into the assessment. We intentionally put it where we did because you can postulate a bunch of scenarios and you can evaluate each scenario for the probability of leading to the consequence without knowing the likelihood of the attack. However, when you're trying to compare scenarios to each other, you really need to know the attack likelihood to be able to compare apples to apples the risk from one scenario versus another. For example, if you have a DBT level attack, maximum DBT level by, say, a terrorist group, that's going to have probably a higher likelihood of proceeding to radiological release compared to a single insider. However, if the single insider is 100 times more likely to make the attack than that DBT level attack, that changes your perspective when you are looking at the risk results. So we showed it basically just as an input for results ranking and prioritization, which is essentially just a comparison of the scenario results in order to gain the insights needed for risk-informed decision making. And what are we making decisions on? We're really making decisions on the security posture. Is there something that we can do to improve it? Can we reduce unnecessary security measures that aren't really significantly reducing risk but have high cost? So we were able to do things more efficiently. Are there some areas where we have weak security that we didn't previously know about, but the risk-informed evaluation revealed that to us, and so we can beef that up? So that's really where we're making our decisions. There is also a dashed line from security posture to attack likelihood. The reason for that is the deterrence factor for physical security specifically. If you have an adversary that is thinking about attacking the plant, if that plant is heavily defended, they might think twice because there's a good chance they would lose their life trying to attack it. Whereas if you say, well, I'm very secure and my risk is low, so I'm going to reduce my security posture, that may encourage an adversary to make the attack if they see that the facility is not as heavily guarded. So that's something that does need to be directly assessed. It's different from the way that we do safety PRA, but it needs to be accounted for risk-informed security. So the framework is done now, but there's still a lot of work left for the working group to do. One thing I wanted to point out is that there are a lot of methods and tools that currently exist for many elements of the framework. For example, we've got good security effectiveness software that can be used for determining the probability of a physical adversary being successful in their attack. We also have good PRA models that can be used for the facility response assessment. We don't have to develop a new security PRA to be able to do that. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel on things that already have good tools. But we do need guidance to be able to address the gaps and show how methods can be properly integrated for risk-informed assessment. There's, again, a lot of work left to be done. So we purposely chose to narrow our near-term focus and look specifically at commercial power reactors. That includes both the existing fleet as well as advanced reactors and SMRs. Still a very, I would say, challenging scope there, but it eliminates some aspects of things. For example, essentially all power plants have a a PRA model, so we don't have to really discuss as much what you would do for a facility that maybe has some other type of risk assessment that's not PRA. And then we also chose to focus on the health and safety of the public, specifically radiological release due to sabotage. Doesn't mean that other types of facilities or that theft of special nuclear material or other types of consequences, all of those things are important and things that I believe do need to be addressed in the long term. But by narrowing our focus, it gives us a smaller bite to chew to be able to work through the methodology and guidance. We are still focusing on physical security, cybersecurity, and combined physical and cyber attacks. We believe that's important because there's a lot going on right now for the nuclear power industry with physical and cybersecurity, and we don't want to develop a method that only works for physical security and not cyber or vice versa. So what we're working on right now is two elements that kind of fit within that overall approach. One is attack likelihood, which I believe is the hardest problem to solve, and I think that there's a lot of value in tackling that one early to see if we can develop a good solution. It may turn out that we can't, and we need to shift gears a little bit and do something that's, I would say, less ideal, but that would be good to know sooner rather than later. So we are actively working on attack likelihood right now. And then the other area that we're working on is scenario development, which basically allows us to wrap our arms around the problem, ranging from terrorists to insider threats or criminals, like being able to say these are the scenarios that we really care about and are important will tell us how big the problem is that we need to address in the guidance. So I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit and focus specifically on attack likelihood for the remainder of this presentation. As I mentioned before, this is a challenging and controversial topic. And I wrote a paper for the ANS conference last week that if anybody is interested, I can definitely get you a copy of that. I'm not going to cover all the detail in that paper, but I'm going to touch on some of the highlights in this presentation. Basically, the bottom line is that developing a robust technical solution for attack likelihood is difficult, but it's possible and it's valuable. And so that's why I'm personally dedicating a fair amount of my time to be able to make that happen. And I think it's going to allow us to really do all of the stuff for risk-informed security that we've been talking about. So kind of a little background of on kind of where we came from. So the current fleet was designed and built using deterministic methods with defense in depth. We didn't have PRA models when we first built most of the plants that are operating today. And I would say that those methods, the deterministic methods and the defense in depth methods, were robust. We have a very safe nuclear fleet, but we can do better. And PRA showed that when we first developed PRA models in the 80s and early 90s, we gained some incredible insights that allowed us to identify things that we can do better. And this figure from NEI has core damage frequency on the y-axis. And you can see that there was a significant drop in core damage frequency based on those early insights. And we continued to reduce safety risk over time through the first risk-informed application maintenance rule and numerous other risk-informed applications after that. So we've got 30, 40, even 50 years of experience with PRA for safety, and nobody argues with the value that we get from PRA. It has improved safety and it's reduced cost, and that and is really important. It's not that we're making a decision about are we safe or do we save money. We're doing both. We're becoming more safe and we're saving more money by doing risk applications. And the reason we can do that is because we're focusing on what matters most. So you look at security, and over the years, there have been some tweaks that have been done. People have tried to do refinements, but it's always deterministic, and we don't have the benefits for security that we have gained for safety. So really the goal is to be able to say, how can we reproduce what we've done on the safety side for security and get those same benefits? On this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of a comparison between the deterministic and probabilistic methods used for safety and security. On the deterministic safety side, we have standard design basis accident scenarios that have to be addressed, and they're evaluated based on prescriptive rules and acceptance criteria. For example, the single failure criteria, where you assume a single active failure, like one train failure or things like that, has to be included in a safety analysis. Because we have an implicit assumption that a design basis accident will occur, we end up focusing on the bounding scenarios. So the scenarios basically cover anything up to and including the DBA, but because the DBA is more likely to, is a bigger challenge to the safety systems in general, it gets more attention than the lesser challenges. There are uncertainties in that safety assessment, but they're implicitly addressed through the use of conservatism. So when we're evaluating a large loca, we use minimum water levels and minimum or maximum temperature profiles, depending on what's more conservative and bounding, to be able to address that uncertainty. If you look at the security side, it's very similar. We have standard design basis threat scenarios that are evaluated using force-on-force exercises with prescriptive rules and acceptance criteria. And again, we end up focusing on the bounding scenarios due to the implicit assumption that the DBT will occur. If you have the full DBT level attack, that's more likely to cause radiological release than if you have half the DBT trying to attack the facility. So you end up, I kind of call it like you're putting blinders on and you're focused on the things that are showing up based on the rules as the most risk significant, and potentially missing some stuff that may be bounded from an analytical perspective, but could end up being risk significant. And again, we address the uncertainties implicitly through the use of conservatism. On the safety side, we do safety PRA models where we look at a wide range of scenarios and we evaluate those scenarios, including beyond design basis events, but we look at things that are significantly less than design basis, including just a normal reactor trip, which does have the potential to lead to core damage and radiological release. And beyond design basis events also, as Fukushima showed us, those have the potential to lead to radiological release. In the PRA models, we evaluate a combination of active failures, common cause failures, and human failures. We're not limiting ourselves to a single active failure, but we're looking at the fact that the combinations of failures can and do occur. And 3 Mile Island was a good example of that, where you had multiple failures that resulted in a core damage event. And we assess that based on the probabilities of each of those types of failures. We also directly estimate the initiating event frequencies for each type of initiator, which is different from what we do on the safety side, where we basically just assume that the accident will occur. And because we're evaluating things realistically rather than conservatively, we have to explicitly address the uncertainties. On the security side, we don't currently do security PRA, but that doesn't mean that we don't have any probabilistic methods for security. We do actually have good security effectiveness software that will give you the probability of adversary success given that an attack is postulated to occur. What we don't have is methods for estimating attack frequencies. So that's really what I've identified as the missing link. If we were able to solve that one piece of it, we could essentially do everything for risk-informed security that we do for safety. And again, we could assess the uncertainties explicitly using the same types of methods that we use on the safety side. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate, the quantitative definition of risk is important, as defined by Kaplan and Garrick. What can go wrong? How likely is it? What are the consequences? Likelihood is a key element in that risk triplet. And if you remove it, what Kaplan and Garrick said is that you no longer have a risk assessment, you have a hazard assessment. I think that's important because there's been a lot of debate over, well, can we solve the attack likelihood problem? Maybe we should just leave it out and assess things without attack likelihood, or without likelihood at all. And I would argue that you are potentially changing the definition of risk by doing that. You may be doing something that's valuable, that helps to manage security, and maybe even helps reduce security risk, but you're really not doing a risk assessment at that point if you don't consider likelihood. So I think probably a lot of you are very familiar with how likelihood is used in safety applications, but basically it's a general term that encompasses both frequency and probability, where frequency is a rate of occurrence over a given period of time, and probability is a value between 0 and 1. Both of those aspects of likelihood are used in safety PRA models. We have initiating event frequencies for various initiators, and then we have probabilities for basic event failures, like a pump failing to start or run, a valve failing to open, as well as human failures and common cause failures. A lot of times I've heard people say, well, it's easy to assess likelihood for safety PRA because there's lots of data. For security, you don't have the data, so it's very difficult. But that's not really a true statement. You can say it's easy now because it's been done and accepted, but if you look at some areas of PRA, for example, large locas, we can't use statistical data because we've never had a large loca occur. So you can't just take the number of events that have occurred over time and divide it by the number of reactor years. If the numerator is 0, that doesn't give you anything. So what's been done is loca frequencies have been evaluated through expert elicitation as documented in NUREG 1829. And if you look at that NUREG, there are large bands of uncertainty. There's orders of magnitude difference in what the group of experts thought the frequency would be for large locas. And so it's not a well-settled science where we know exactly what the frequency is. It's very uncertain. But even with that uncertainty, we've been able to gain very meaningful risk insights for large locas and other events as parts of, as elements in PRA models. And I kind of want to illustrate that with this table. This is from an actual plant PRA model. I just took a few of the initiators that I thought were relevant. So we've got initiating event frequency, conditional core damage probability. So assuming the event occurs, what's the likelihood of having core damage? And if you multiply those two columns together, you get the core damage frequency contribution. So let's say that we don't have initiating event frequency, and all we've got is this conditional core damage probability. Well, you'd look at that and you say, okay, so 10 to the minus 7, minus 5th, minus 6. Oh my goodness, reactor vessel rupture, 90% conditional core damage probability. Well, that's huge. That's my most significant initiator. I probably need to do something about that. But then you think about it and you're like, well, okay, that's a very unlikely event to occur. It may not even be credible. We're going to call this a beyond design basis event, which is basically what we do from a safety analysis perspective. Reactor vessel rupture is not considered as a design basis accident. So we'll get rid of that one. And what do we see in the rest of the results? Well, we see that loss of offsite power, medium and large loca, those are the ones that are on the order of 10 to the minus 5th and are more risk significant than the other events. So that tells you something meaningful. If those events happen, there's a reasonably high conditional core damage probability. But now if you factor in the initiating event frequencies, what do you see? You see that reactor trip and loss of offsite power are the two most significant contributors with respect to core damage frequency. And the other events are, the locas are a couple orders of magnitude, or even 3 orders of magnitude or 4, less likely to occur. And so those are basically in the weeds in terms of risk contribution compared to the reactor trip and loss of offsite power. So that's a very significant insight. The other thing you'll notice is that reactor vessel rupture, it's lower than reactor trip and loss of offsite power, but it's not a lot lower. It's still a fairly significant contributor to core damage frequency. Those are meaningful insights that you gain by having the initiating event frequency, and the types of insights that I believe we can gain on the security side from quantifying attack likelihood as well. So when we talk about attack likelihood for security applications, this has been discussed for a long time, and there are a lot of concerns that have been raised. People will say, well, equipment failures are intentional rather than random. So you can't just use historical data. You also can't use a simple Bayesian approach to estimate attack likelihood. An adversary decision to attack is dependent on the level of security, the deterrence factor, which is different from what we do for safety. Attack likelihood changes over time and may be affected by political decisions or other factors that could occur within countries or the world. There's a high level of uncertainty that could make it difficult to achieve statistically meaningful insights. And finally, the regulatory requirements simply don't allow it. So all of those are valid concerns and things that do need to be addressed. When people look at those concerns, they generally form one of the following conclusions. Some people say it's an impossible problem to solve. We can't do it because it's impossible. Others say, well, no, it actually might be possible, but it would have so much uncertainty that the results wouldn't be meaningful. And some people conclude that, hey, it's just not worth the effort. It's a lot of work to do it. We don't really know what the results might show us, and it's not worth the effort to do it. Something I wanted to point out is that all of those arguments could have been made with respect to safety PRA models. If we didn't have PRA as a well-established and accepted practice today, people could make exactly the same arguments with respect to developing large local frequencies or at-WIS frequencies. Any of our initiators that are very rare, you could say those exact same things. And in fact, people have said that. This statement, some hold a philosophic view that there is no such thing as a numerical value for the probability of occurrence of a catastrophic accident, that such a thing is unknowable. Basically, they're saying that the likelihood of having an accident that causes core damage and radiological release is not something that you can possibly know. That was a statement made in WASH 740 in 1957, some 15 or so years before Norm Rasmussen developed WASH 1400 and the first PRA model. Basically, Dr. Rasmussen proved them wrong by actually quantifying the likelihood of a catastrophic accident. Now, there were a lot of people at the time that questioned the work in WASH 1400 and didn't believe that the numbers were correct. And it was actually at the point where it may have been completely rejected and we wouldn't have had PRA today if it hadn't been for the 3 Mile Island accident, which validated one of the major conclusions in WASH 1400, that a small loca can be more risk significant than a large loca. Remember when I mentioned earlier that the focus on the bounding design basis accident causes you to potentially miss a smaller accident that may be less of a challenge for the safety systems, but a small loca is a lot more likely to occur than a large loca and can, in fact, through combinations of failures or human failures, result in the same radiological release or core damage type event that we are focused on from a safety analysis perspective for large locas. So why not do this for security? Because it's worked so well for safety. A lot of people have pointed to some remarks that Norm Rasmussen made with respect to that way back in fall of 1976. And these remarks basically indicate that he didn't believe it was possible. He said, "I do not believe that the safeguards risks can be quantified using these procedures," referring to the WASH 1400 PRA methods. He also said an overall quantitative risk assessment of the safeguards issue is at present beyond the capability of the methodology. So that's coming from the father of PRA, obviously someone well-respected, someone we should listen to. And he said, you can't really use PRA for safeguards or security. So why am I saying today that we can use it? Well, if you keep reading in the remarks that he wrote, there's another statement in there. He was referring to some work that was ongoing at the time, looking at how you could use PRA methods for security. And he said, if this type of work continues, and I hope it will, it is reasonable to hope that these methods may someday produce meaningful quantitative assessments of the effectiveness of various systems. These assessments would be particularly valuable in the early stages of facility design when modifications can be readily made. So Norm Rasmussen was not saying that we can never use PRA methods for security. He was essentially saying that the methods at the time were not viable to be able to risk-informed security or develop a security PRA. And there are a couple specific things that he identified, and I addressed those more in the paper that I wrote for the ANS conference. I'm not going to go into it now, but basically the two things that he identified, we do have solutions to address both of those things today. And it's really not, the items that he identified as a roadblock 50 years ago are not a roadblock today. So my conclusions are that there are real technical challenges with quantifying attack likelihood. It's absolutely not an easy problem to solve, but it's also not an impossible problem to solve. And after 50 years of PRA model development and applications, I believe we have all the tools we need to quantitatively estimate attack likelihood and address the uncertainties. And I believe that we can achieve the same benefits for security that we've gained for safety, and that it's absolutely worth the effort. I just want to leave you with a couple quotes. Bob Budis said that there is nothing that we know absolutely nothing about. And Stan Kaplan says, statistics is the science of handling data. Probability is the science of handling the lack of data. Essentially, what those two quotes are saying is that even though we don't have all of the details of what an adversary might be thinking and wanting to do and how likely they are to do it, it doesn't mean we don't know anything about their intentions and the likelihood. And so we can put some bounds on it. And within those bounds, within that uncertainty bounds, we can use probabilities to represent that likelihood. And so I believe there is a very real path forward to be able to do for security what we're currently doing for safety. So my contact information is listed here if anybody would like to reach out to me. And with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
Thanks. Excuse me. Sorry. Thanks, Tim. So we got one question in the chat, and then if there none other pop up, then I do have one for you. But Steve Nesbitt's asking, what is the relationship between your work and the ongoing, number one, the limited scope rulemaking for advanced reactor security, and then number two, security under Part 53?
Yeah, good question. So I don't necessarily have all the details on the rulemaking, but from what I've seen, basically the rulemaking is still very deterministic. There are some mentions of risk-informed methods or application of the risk triplet for security. But when you look at the details of what the guidance says, it basically is still a very deterministic method. So sometimes sharpening the pencil on things, but certainly not what I would refer to as a risk-informed approach.
And Part 53, Tim?
For security under Part 53, and again, I don't, I haven't read through all of the details on that, so somebody may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation from what I have seen is that it is still essentially a deterministic approach on the security side.
I wonder, Steve, if you want to offer more information on either of these. I'm asking Steve Nesbitt.
First, I have to find my unmute button. And now that I've done that, I agree with Tim's assessment. I don't think that I think the current efforts underway are kind of much smaller in scope than what the framework that they're developing is kind of aiming at.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
And
Thank
so,
you, Steve. Tim, I'd like to ask, have you thought about incorporating the combination of risk-informed and performance-based approaches? Because a performance-based approach using an objectives hierarchy can do a lot of the same things that you have addressed in your slides. I mean, at this point, I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, good question. I really believe this is both a risk-informed and performance-based approach. We're referring to it as risk-informed, but there would be performance monitoring that would be included as part of it. We are not proposing the development of a security PRA model by any means, but using the information that everything that goes into the framework that I showed, that would be something that you don't just do once and put on the shelf. You would update it with changes at the facility, and you would consider any impacts so that you're managing performance over time.
But have you thought about using an objectives hierarchy that is spelled out in NUREG BR 0303, guidance for performance-based regulation?
I'm not familiar with that new reg. No, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Let's move on. Brandon, I think you had something.
yeah, so Tim, I'd really like the starting with the framework, right? I mean, I think that, roughing out the idea and kind of shaping it into something from the top down gives folks kind of the chance to test drive piece parts and allows refinements as you move on. I guess the question here is maybe is part regulatory and maybe part conceptual, but the aircraft impact rule, 10 CFR 5150, that is kind of sitting out on its own right now. I guess, is there any like technical reason? I guess I'm not looking for the regulatory piece of it, but like, is there any technical reason that this framework wouldn't be able to be used for something like that? I mean, are there bounds that have been identified as you looked at this framework? Or yeah, anything to those lines?
No, yeah, the framework is high enough level that you certainly could incorporate the aircraft impact as part of the overall risk-informed assessment for security. It's not really something we've talked about within the working group at this point, but I don't see any reason at all that you couldn't merge that in with everything else if there was benefit to doing that.
Well, this is Steve Cron. I think what Brandon might have been getting at is that the aircraft crash standard is updated, not frequently, but updated on a fairly regular basis to input actual experience with aircraft crashes in the areas of concern of nuclear facilities. So that is a fairly clear performance measure, which allows you to take that performance-based action, which I was recently involved with in doing for Savannah River, at the K facility, for example. Is there a figure of merit that has that type of weight within the security industry that could be used for that performance-based nature of your standards development?
I'm not sure if I completely understand the question. Are you asking that? Well, first of all, are you considering like an intentional crash or an accidental crash, which would, I think, be kind of the difference?
No, we're
between
only
safety
using
versus...
that as an example of a performance measure.
Okay.
So are there security performance measures that have that level of weight and consensus among the security analysis community?
I I would say no. Well, so security effectiveness, there's been talk about having a certain probability of security effectiveness be kind of the standard. If you're above that probability, you're good. If you're below it, you need more security. So that might kind of fit that. But security effectiveness within the risk informed framework is just one piece of it. And my intention, if you're looking at radiological release specifically for, let's say, an existing reactor that has a safety PRA model that considers core damage frequency and large early release frequency, I believe you could develop a security assessment that also gives you metrics in terms of CDF and LERF, and you could use those metrics for performance-based assessments. Does that answer your question?
I understand that that's what you presented. I was trying to get at a different range, but that's all right. It's a good conversation. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Sure.
But Tim, I think what you have offered by way of a definition of a framework, I think is very, very useful, because that's something a lot of people are struggling with, because the NEMA of 2019, which calls for a regulatory framework that is risk informed and performance based. A lot of people looking at that legislation say, well, what does a framework mean? And I think even the NRC struggles with that. So I think the way you have presented it is very useful, and I would suggest should be used as the sort of standard for looking at what is a framework. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that comment.
Tim, if we go back to your wiring diagram briefly, as a practicing systems engineer, it seems interesting that when we set up process flow diagrams in systems engineering, we look at them in the way in the framework of inputs, processes, and outputs, and at least the arrows don't indicate a clear output of this process.
Yeah, and that's something that we've talked about a bit. I don't know that I would necessarily call this a process diagram. It's really more of a relational diagram. It shows how the pieces fit together. You need to know the scenario to assess security effectiveness, and you need to know the security posture to assess security effectiveness. It's not saying that you have to have a set of XYZ inputs necessarily. It's really just showing how those pieces fit together.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anything more on the board, Brandon?
No, sir.
Well, then I think all that remains is to thank Tim for a very, very informative and well put together presentation. And we look forward to seeing the community practice again in the July timeframe. Thanks
Great, thank you very
thanks
much.
for your time, everybody.